Hey everyone, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. You know the drill. You send us the good stuff that's got you thinking, and we unpack it all together with a nice drink in hand.
Always a good time.
You know, speaking of getting people thinking, last time we really got the comments section fired up with, what if Taiwan was the powerful one? Scenario.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of strong reactions, especially from our listeners in Taiwan. Some of you were ready to give China a taste of their own medicine.
I mean, can you blame them?
Not at all. And that kind of leads perfectly into what we're diving into today. We got a submission from a listener about a rumor that was spreading online that the Dalai Lama had called for Taiwan to liberate China.
Oh, yeah. I remember seeing that floating around.
Yeah, it caused a bit of a stir online, especially in Taiwan. A lot of folks were understandably upset.
Yeah, makes sense. I can see why that would rub people the wrong way.
Totally. But here's the thing. Fact-checking websites found no evidence that the Dalai Lama ever actually said that. It seems like this whole thing just kind of blew up without any actual truth behind it.
Yeah. It's wild how quickly something like that can spread, especially when it comes to sensitive topics like the China-Taiwan relationship. You know, emotions are already running high. People are looking for information that confirms what they already believe. And all of a sudden, a completely made-up story starts looking like a fact.
It's scary how easily that can happen. It's like,
yeah.
I don't know. Remember that time everyone thought insert celebrity name was secretly living in a small town in Idaho?
Mm-hmm.
Totally fake, but people were eating it up.
Oh, yeah.
It just shows you how important fact-checking is, especially when it comes to complex and emotionally charged issues like this. I mean, we're talking about real-world consequences here, not just some silly internet drama.
Right, because believing misinformation can lead to people making decisions based on things that aren't even true. And that can have a ripple effect, you know? It can impact relationships between countries, between people. It can escalate tensions and lead to all sorts of problems.
Exactly. So the question for today's deep dive is, how do we become better fact-checkers, especially when we're dealing with these kind of sensitive or controversial topics?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It's a skill we could all benefit from honing.
For sure. And it's not always easy, right? Especially if you don't have access to those fancy fact-checking websites or teams of researchers.
Yeah.
Like, what about people who live in places where the government censors information like China? How do they even begin to figure out what's true when access to information is so restricted?
That's a really good point. It adds a whole other layer of difficulty to the whole thing.
Yeah.
But, you know, even in those kinds of environments where information is tightly controlled, people have come up with some pretty ingenious ways to get to the truth.
Okay, I'm all ears. Spill the beans. What are some of these techniques?
Well, think of it like this. If you're trying to get to something that's blocked off, you got to find a way around it, right? And that's where things like VPNs come in. They're basically like secret tunnels that allow you to bypass those restrictions and access websites that would normally be blocked.
Oh, so it's like a digital invisibility cloak. So people in China could use a VPN to like read articles from international news sources that they wouldn't normally be able to access.
Exactly. It's like having a window to the outside world, even when you're physically located in a place with tight internet controls. But of course, there are risks involved.
Yeah, I can imagine the Chinese government probably isn't too happy about people using VPNs to get around their censorship.
Right. It's a constant game of cat and mouse. The authorities are trying to crack down on VPN use, and people are finding new ways to stay under the radar.
So it takes some serious tech skills and bravery to seek out those alternative sources of information in places like that?
It definitely does. And even if you can't access outside sources, there are still ways to sort of read between the lines of what you're being told.
So it's all about being proactive and skeptical and willing to put in a little effort to separate truth from fiction.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, how about we shift gears a bit and talk about how these different approaches to information control play out in real-world situations? Like, what are the tangible effects of living in a society that embraces fact-checking versus one where it's actively suppressed?
It's like we're looking at two completely different worlds, right? You've got Taiwan, where freedom of the press is like built into their DNA. People can speak their minds, criticize the government, and they don't have to worry about getting in trouble for it. And then you've got mainland China, where the government keeps a tight grip on what people see and hear, and anyone who steps out of line is going to face some serious consequences.
It's a night and day difference, and it has a huge impact on how people live their lives, how they think about the world, everything.
So let's break it down a bit. What are some real-world examples of how these two different approaches to information actually play out? Let's start with Taiwan. What does a society that values fact-checking actually look like on the ground?
Well, one thing you notice right away is that the media landscape is way more diverse. You've got a ton of different news outlets, all with their own perspectives and biases, and people are encouraged to get their news from multiple sources to get a more balanced view of things.
It's like having a whole buffet of information to choose from. You can try a little bit of everything and decide what you like best.
Exactly. And because there's no one entity controlling the narrative, there's a lot more room for debate and discussion. People are free to question things, to challenge authority, and to form their own opinions based on the evidence.
It sounds like a much more intellectually stimulating environment. You're not just passively absorbing information, you're actively engaging with it and coming to your own conclusions.
Right. And the active engagement leads to a more informed and engaged citizenry. People are more likely to participate in the political process, to hold their leaders accountable, and to demand transparency.
Okay, so that's the sunny side of things in Taiwan. But what about mainland China? What happens when fact-checking is basically off the table?
Well, it creates a very different kind of atmosphere. The media is much more controlled, with state-run outlets dominating the airwaves and the internet.
So you're not getting a lot of different viewpoints or critical analysis of the government's actions.
Not really. And because there's this constant threat of censorship, people start to censor themselves. They're afraid to say anything that might be seen as critical of the government, even in private.
Wow, that sounds super suffocating. Like you can't even trust your own thoughts.
It can be pretty oppressive, especially for people who value open dialogue and debate. It also creates a culture of distrust where people are suspicious of everything the government says and does.
It's like the more the government tries to control information, the less people trust them.
Exactly. And that lack of trust can have some pretty serious consequences. It undermines people's faith in institutions, it can lead to social unrest, and it makes it really hard to address important issues.
It sounds like a recipe for disaster.
It can be.
Yeah.
And it also makes it super difficult for people to make good decisions about their own lives. If you're not getting accurate information about things like health education or the economy, how are you supposed to know what's best for you and your family?
It's like driving a car with a broken speedometer. You might think you're going the right speed, but you could be heading straight for a crash.
Perfect analogy. It really highlights how important it is to have access to good information both for individuals and for society as a whole. And, perhaps the most important tool of all, no matter where you live, is critical thinking.
Preach. Critical thinking is like a superpower in this day and age.
It really is. Think about the Dalai Lama rumor we talked about earlier. Even without access to external websites, someone with strong critical thinking skills might stop and ask, hold on, does this claim actually align with what I already know about the Dalai Lama?
Yeah.
About his beliefs and actions?
Right. I mean, he's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He's literally a symbol of peace and nonviolence.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't make much sense for him to be advocating for any kind of violent liberation.
Exactly. So even without all the information at your fingertips, critical thinking can be a really powerful tool for questioning what you're told and making sure you're not just blindly accepting everything you hear.
It makes you realize just how different things are in Taiwan. From what I understand, they have a much freer press than mainland China, and they even have organizations dedicated to fact-checking, like the Taiwan Fact Check Center.
It's a pretty stark contrast. In Taiwan, you have a society that encourages questioning official narratives, where people are exposed to multiple viewpoints and where fact-checking resources are readily available. It really highlights how essential freedom of the press and access to information are for a healthy democracy.
Which makes you wonder, if we flip the script and it was Taiwan controlling the narrative, would they resort to the same tactics as China? Would they try to block information about figures like the Dalai Lama or control the historical narrative to fit their own agenda?
It's an interesting thought experiment, isn't it? It kind of reminds us that power can be corrupting no matter who holds it. That's why having these systems in place that protect freedom of speech and encourage critical thinking are so important.
So the big takeaway here is that it's not just about what information is available. It's also about having the freedom to question and challenge that information.
Mm-hmm.
It's about having the tools and the courage to seek out the truth, even when it's difficult or even risky.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now let's take a sip of our mention drink and maybe start digging into how those in power actually go about controlling the narrative. It really is a powerful tool, isn't it? Being able to control what people see and hear and ultimately believe.
Oh, absolutely. It's like they say, he who controls a narrative controls the world. And the Chinese Communist Party, they've definitely mastered the art of narrative control, wouldn't you say?
They've had a lot of practice, that's for sure. But thinking back to that Dalai Lama rumor, it really shows how easily a fabricated story can take hold and influence how people view a situation, even when there's absolutely no truth to it.
And they're not just good at spreading rumors, right? They've got a whole arsenal of techniques to shape what people know and think.
Oh yeah, for sure. One of their most powerful tools is straight-up information control. They block access to certain websites, filter search results, and censor social media posts like crazy. It's like they're creating their own carefully curated version of reality where only certain voices and perspectives are allowed to be heard.
It's like trying to build a house with only half the materials. It might look okay from the outside, but it's not going to be very stable in the long run.
Perfect analogy. And it's not just about blocking information. They also use propaganda to push their own version of events, often using language that plays on people's emotions and fears.
It's like that old saying, repeat a lie often enough, and it becomes the truth.
And sadly, that's often how it works. And with the rise of social media, it's easier than ever to spread those kinds of narratives far and wide.
I remember reading in one of those articles you sent that the Chinese government actually employs thousands of people to monitor online activity and try to control what people are saying. It's like a digital army dedicated to shaping public opinion.
It's a massive undertaking, but it shows how seriously they take information control. They understand the power of the internet to influence people's minds, and they're not afraid to use it to their advantage.
So we've talked about the censorship, but what about those more subtle forms of influence?
Oh, they're masters of those too. They often use what's called soft power, which basically means using things like cultural diplomacy, educational exchanges, and even tourism to promote a positive image of China and their policies around the world.
So it's not just about controlling what people see, it's about shaping how they feel about China as well.
Exactly. It's about winning hearts and minds, not just silencing dissent. They want the world to see China as a benevolent force, a leader in innovation and economic development.
It's like a PR campaign on a global scale.
You could say that. And they've actually been pretty successful at it. They've built strong relationships with governments, businesses, and cultural institutions in many parts of the world.
But doesn't that kind of soft power have the potential to be manipulative too? I mean, if you're only presenting one side of the story, you're not really giving people the full picture, are you?
That's a valid concern for sure. It's important to be aware of potential biases and to always try to get information from multiple sources. Don't just accept everything you're told at face value, especially when it comes from a source that has a vested interest in shaping your opinion.
So it all comes back to that critical thinking, doesn't it? Being able to step back and evaluate the information you're receiving and making sure you're not being led astray.
Absolutely. It's our best defense against manipulation, whether it's coming from governments, corporations, or even our own internal biases. Don't just accept what you're told at face value. Do your own research, compare different sources, and be willing to change your mind if new evidence emerges.
It's like we have to be detectives of the information age. Look out for clues and trying to piece together the truth from the fragments of information we find.
I love that. And we've talked a lot about the negative side of narrative control, how it can be used to manipulate and mislead, but there's a positive side too. Storytelling can be an incredibly powerful force for good in the world.
Right, like it can inspire us, connect us to each other, and help us see the world in new ways.
Exactly. It can be used to promote social change, to raise awareness about important issues, and to foster empathy and understanding.
So it really depends on who is telling the story and how they're using it.
It's like a knife. It can be used to harm or to heal, depending on who is wielding it.
This makes me think about our friend Micky in Taiwan. He has that YouTube channel, Mickytolife, where he shares his travels around Taiwan, his whiskey reviews, and just his general love for life.
Oh, yeah. I love Micky's channel. He's got such a positive energy. It's always a joy to watch his videos.
I know, right? I think he's a great example of how storytelling can be a force for good. He's not trying to control the narrative or push any agenda. He's just sharing his experiences and his passion with the world, and it's so inspiring.
I totally agree. He's a reminder that even in a world that can feel so negative and divided, there is still so much beauty and joy to be found. And sometimes all it takes is one person sharing their story to make a difference.
Well said. All right, we've covered a lot today, and I think we're all ready for another sip of our mentioned drink. We might complain about the constant news cycle or the echo chambers on social media, but at least we have the option to seek out different viewpoints and to challenge the information we're given.
It's a privilege we shouldn't take for granted, that's for sure. And it's something we need to actively protect because it can disappear if we don't.
Absolutely. We can all be little truth warriors in our own circles. whether it's fact-checking a social media post or having a respectful conversation with someone who sees things differently. It's not about having all the answers. It's about being open to learning and growing and constantly refining our understanding of the world.
Couldn't agree more.
And remember, the world needs more truth seekers, more critical thinkers, and more people who are willing to challenge the narratives that are trying to divide us. So stay curious, stay skeptical, and keep those fact-checking muscles strong.
Cheers to that.
Cheers. Thanks for joining us on another deep dive, and we'll see you next time.